Got a camera being stubborn, so I told Hamilton if they need me to move up to the pulpit, I'll do that. See, I'll stay down here unless y'all just holler at me. Go ahead and go up there. Okay. Somebody may say, "Hey, that's just the better if we can't see him." I still have, by the way, several of these chronologies if anybody needs one. That's kind of just a chronology of the Inter-Testamental period and what was going on. We are looking at that chronology. We're around. We talked last week about 480 BC, Greek naval victory at Salamis. Xerxes returns home. Then you have, we kind of touched on Artaxerxes the first ruling over the Persian Empire, which was the time period of Nehemiah. Takes you down to about 424 BC. And then 334 to 323, somewhere in that range, Alexander the Great conquers the East. That's sort of where we left off. What we're going to do today, and Adam, I forgot, it may already be up, or is it? Do we have that PowerPoint of Persian rulers? And that's not any kind of hurry, but I'll mention that in just a moment. What we're going to do today, where are the rest of my notes? Here we go. I was about to have a panic there. I thought I'd left some of my notes again. We're going to talk about kind of bridging the gap here. Some of this is familiar. Talk about Samaritans, synagogue worship. A lot of times, I was thinking about this the other day. Somebody might really, really say, I'm showing my age or something, but I sometimes wish in this class I had like a chalkboard or something that I could just write on immediately. And I don't know, maybe I need to get with Hamilton and or Brian, and there might be a way that I could somehow connect, like have my laptop up here or even down there at that lectern and type and then update it on the screen. That might would work. I don't know, but sometimes I wish I could write stuff down that maybe I think about in the class and just have that before you. But what you may want to write down on a piece of paper, or you may know this just in your mind already, but we often talk about the four world empires leading up to the advent of the Messiah. You have Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. And it's in the days of the Roman kings that Jesus was born into this world. We often talk about maybe if you ever hear somebody do just a single lesson on intertestamental period or the fullness of time or something to that effect, you'll see something like, or hear something like what I'm talking about now. We'll often talk about the contribution of each world empire to the fullness of time. Babylon's contribution being primarily synagogue worship. And then you have the Medo-Persian Empire. There was this sense of law and order, that even the king had to obey the laws that he signed into effect. It's not to say that the king was not able to change any laws, because he was, but if the king made a decree, such as in Daniel 6, for 30 days you can't pray to anyone but the king, and if you do, you're going in the lion's den. If the king made such a decree, well, then they called Daniel on that. Guess what? Daniel did just that. And so he says, the text tells us that the king sought to deliver Daniel. But they remind him, oh, no, king. You made this law, and even you obey this law. It's not just something you can change on a whim. So there's that sense of law and order. And when you come to the Grecian Empire, of course, probably the main contribution will be the Greek language, Koine Greek, Common Greek. And it's such a flexible language. The old saying, the Greeks have a word for it. It's going to be the medium by which the New Testament is communicated. And what a perfect fit that was for the language of the New Testament. And then when you get to Rome, of course, you'll have, there are actually several that you could talk about. I don't know, it's hard to say, just pick one, which not to say that Greece, Babylon, and Medo-Persia don't have several as well. You know, it's not like there's just synagogue worship from Babylon, but those are the big ones. But when you get to Rome, it's hard to choose just one big one because you have the peace, Pax Romanus, the peace of Rome. That made a huge difference in the spread of the gospel. You have also, you have that law and order that carries over, which kind of goes with the peace. But what's one of the things we think of with Rome? Yeah, all roads lead to Rome. We've pointed out before, it's kind of, I guess it'd be more appropriate to say all roads lead from Rome because they all built out from the capital. But yeah, the road system, and you talk about making it easier to take the gospel into all the world, and that peace of Rome, P-E-A-C-E, is going to allow Paul sometimes to say, well, I'm a Roman citizen. Are you going to beat a Roman citizen uncondemned? And they kind of go, okay, well, hold on. So there are all these different contributions. So some of this that we're talking about today kind of catches us up on that. But I also want to mention, thank you, Adam, that, let's see, that's Assyrian. Let's go to Babylonian and Persian rulers. I want to mention this. This is sometimes you have those moments where you're like, you just want to shout and celebrate because you know somebody's listening if they come and they say, hey, hang on I don't know, I'm not sure about this. And so that happened to me last Sunday. I think it was Sunday afternoon. Brother Ken came and he said, hey, about this right down here, Darius the Third. We mentioned that seems to be the Darius of Nehemiah 12:22. Well, I sort of read that. It's just sort of a passing reference in Pfeiffer's book, Between the Testaments, for those who I may not have mentioned the title of it in a while, but that's kind of been it's not my only source, but I've learned in a class like this, if you try to lean on too many sources very heavily, you'll be teaching forever. So I've kind of used that to guide our studies. But there's just sort of a passing reference to that in there, and I thought, I just read it, but he mentioned that to me and said, you know, that time frame seems odd. And he said, you know, it's a possibility. So I got thinking about that, and I said, well, boy, that, you know, I mean, you're looking up here, you got Artaxerxes and all the references to Nehemiah. Then you have all the way down 335 BC. What's the math there, Bob? I mean, if we go to 423, I'm not even going to attempt it. 335. So, I mean, 90 years, that's a big difference. So that was brought up, and I thought, you know, I mean, I read that passing reference in Pfeiffer, and I don't recall running across this before, so I'm going to do some research. So I did, and here's what I came up with. I think the best explanation and maybe most detailed explanation as well that I have comes from James Burton Kaufman. James Burton Kaufman has a commentary, wrote a commentary. I think he covered every single book in the Bible. Before he died several years ago, he was, I tell people with Brother Kaufman's commentaries, he's a member of the Lord's Church, was a member of the Lord's Church. Again, he's passed from this life. But one of the best things about Brother Kaufman's commentaries is he uses so many sources. And one of the worst things about Brother Kaufman's commentaries is that he uses so many sources. It's kind of a two-edged sword, because sometimes it's hard to read his commentary because you're following this reference and that footnote and this end note, and it can be confusing and not confusing, but just tedious. But it also is kind of nice because he's bringing in so many different sources. Anyhow, all that just to say, here's what he says in commenting on Nehemiah 12:22 regarding the problem of Jaddua. And it might be good for us to turn over to Nehemiah 12 and look at that. But like I said, it's always encouraging to me when somebody brings something like that up. I tell people, I was just talking to somebody recently, and some members of the church, and they were kind of frustrated, discouraged, I guess, because they had mentioned something to a preacher. And it wasn't meant to be a criticism. It was just kind of something very similar to this, just sort of asking a question like, it doesn't seem to be adding up. And the fella got real defensive and almost upset and almost made the people feel like, who are you to question me? I've been studying this kind of thing. And, I was trying to encourage the folks and said, well, we're all human. And nobody has a corner on the market of Bible knowledge. Anybody can study. Certainly a preacher, especially prepared to teach a particular class, you ought to have a specific knowledge of that in preparation. But sometimes you miss stuff because guess what? We're all human. I don't care who you are. I don't care if, I read about people that have been teaching a college course, maybe at one of the brotherhood universities or a preaching school, and this is the course he's taught for 30 years, and sometimes you'll still find something where, in a student's notes where he just, maybe he's tired that day or something, but gave it out wrong. So I tell people, to me, that is, as a teacher, it's encouraging to me, because what that says is somebody is paying attention, and you can see the numbers there, and it doesn't seem like it makes it's as much sense. It doesn't seem like it's an impossibility. Now, if we're talking 200 or 300 years, I think we'd have to say, okay, hold, time out, something's up. But, and that was kind of the question that was asked. It wasn't somebody saying, hey, man, you really messed that up. But it was somebody saying, what about this? And so I think that's, again, to me, that's encouraging because it tells me people are listening. And I'm very, very appreciative of that as a teacher. Anytime you got a situation where students are listening and they're thinking critically, I love it. That's encouraging to me. So here's what Kaufman says. He gives 4 possibilities here. As we pointed out, sometimes this is what happens in our Bible studies, and there are these supposed discrepancies that people will point out. If there's any possible explanation, then you don't have a discrepancy there. Well, there's actually 4 different ones here. He says, number 1, there might easily have been several high priests named Jaddua. And he mentions if there's anything about all these Jewish names we've been studying that stands out above everything else, it's that the same names appear again and again, generation after generation. Well, do we still have that today? Obviously. I was telling somebody the other day, Reagan and I, when she was pregnant with Joshua, we started thinking in terms of names. What do we want to name? We find out it's a boy. What do we want to name him? We went through, we didn't really sit down with a name book or anything like that. We just kind of threw out some names, and somehow or another Joshua came up. And I said, I like Joshua. And she says, well, what is it about Joshua? I said, well, the name means, when you study it, Scripture, it means Jehovah is salvation. I said, I like that. I like the meaning of that name. So we chose Joshua. It was the second most popular name among baby boys that whole, for like a 5-year stretch or something. So poor kid, he's got the same name as just about everybody else. But, that still happens today. It sometimes changes generation to generation, but there are names that are just popular names. He gives an example. Kaufman does 27 Zacharias that we read about. Even among the 12 apostles, there were 2 Simons, 2 James. Nehemiah mentions the Jaddua here, talking about Nehemiah 12. Apparently in his times, Josephus mentions another one more than a century later. And he mentions this, and this is another thing I didn't realize. This is another reason I'm very appreciative of somebody bringing this to my attention, because he says the critics will have to come up with something a lot better than this in order to late date Nehemiah. Some of this is about late dating the book. I don't know that I had run across that before with Nehemiah. But there are so many modern liberal critics that will try to late date books. Now, we've talked about it before with the book of Daniel. They scramble desperately to late date the book of Daniel because the prophecies are so detailed that if you accept the date of the book of Daniel for when it is, you cannot deny there is a miraculous inspirational prophetic element there in that book. And so to get around that, they say, well, it really wasn't written when you say it was. It was written way down here, and he's not prophesying about these rulers that'll come after Alexander. What he's really doing is he's just kind of telling current events, and he's writing it as if it's prophecy, which is kind of amazing to me because they sit there and they'll say, well, the Bible's not really inspired of God, but it is a good book. Oh, so a book that has people that pretend, that lie to you and tell you they're prophesying when really they're writing current events. Oh, but it's a good book. It's kind of like saying, well, I don't think Jesus was the Messiah, but he was a good guy. Are you kidding? He's either a nut or a liar, or he's King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That's it. A good man doesn't lie to you and say, hey, everybody, follow me. I'm the Christ. Good grief. People sometimes lose their mind. So, that's one option. There were numerous people named Jaddua. Number 2, he says, we believe Josephus' identification of Jaddua as the high priest in the times of Alexander the Great is an error by Josephus. By the way, I said we'd turn to Nehemiah 12, and I didn't read the verse. 12:22, he's just listing several people here, priests, Levites, reorganization of service as this part of the reforms of Nehemiah. But verse 22 of chapter 12, the Levites in the day of Eliashib, Joiada, Johanan, and Jaddua were recorded chief of the fathers, also the priest to the reign of Darius the Persian. And by the way, the question to me was, last Sunday, would it not make more sense that this would be Darius the second? Ocus, I'm not sure exactly how you pronounce that. And time-wise, it absolutely would. And the more I study this, having studied it since that question, I think that's probably the better option. So I haven't updated my PowerPoint yet, obviously, but I left it because I wanted to mention that, show it as I showed it last week. So he says, we believe Josephus' identification of Jaddua as a high priest is an error by Josephus. And before we look, not an error by Nehemiah, by the way. Keep that in mind, Josephus. And as he points out, there's not a scholar on earth who has not questioned Josephus' reliability on many things. Josephus was a Jewish historian, but he was an uninspired Jewish historian. And we have to remember that. There are times when he kind of pretty clearly exaggerates. And this happens sometimes with historians, especially if there's a sense of national pride. Remember I told you when we were studying last week, the Persians and all the accounts we have of, we don't have a whole lot to go on of the Persian attempted conquest of Greece except from Grecian sources. And so it gets distorted a little bit. Oh man, there were millions of these ships that came against us and we defeated them all. Well, there were a lot, but you can see where somebody talking about what a great feat their country accomplished, their people accomplished by holding off these mean Persian invaders, and so they trump up the numbers to make it sound even better. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes even unintentional errors, because again, these are uninspired humans. So there have been plenty of times with Josephus that scholars have found him to be in error on some stuff. And so, we often have pointed that out, even other classes. Here's what Josephus says, but bear in mind, that's an uninspired historian. Number 3, it is altogether possible that Jaddua lived to be over 100 years old and might have been high priest in the times of both Nehemiah and Alexander. So this, as we have it here, is a possibility. And I will say that Pfeiffer in his book does say it is, I think he says this I think he says this is perhaps the Darius of Nehemiah 12:22. So, but it is a possibility. Whitcomb stressed this, John C. Whitcomb, we mentioned last week, pointing out that one of the high priests, Jehoiada, died at the age of 130. We read about that in 2 Chronicles 24. That possibility is supported by the fact that Jaddua died very soon after his meeting with Alexander the Great, indicating that he might indeed have been a very old man when that happened. So it is a possibility. Understand that. I don't know if it's the most likely possibility, but it is a possibility. Then number 4, he says there's the very definite possibility that the word Jaddua here is an interpolation. This is what Kaufman thinks is the most likely option. He says it's this writer's opinion that overwhelming odds favor this possibility. Williamson admitted that these lists are defective, not due to the inspired writer, how he wrote them, but because of copyist errors. Without getting into a whole how we got the Bible study, you may recall that from a study we did several years ago, how we got the Bible. There were copyist errors. They didn't have nice fluorescents, LEDs. They wrote many times by candlelight, and they would do this sometimes for hours and hours, and sometimes you're copying lines, and you may recopy the last word from the previous line, or you may recopy the entire previous line as you're looking back over here to your source. So these were copyist errors. The inspired writers were just that, inspired. But the copyists, those who copied down and made copies, they're not inspired, and sometimes they would make errors. And again, sometimes somebody says, well, how do we trust our Bible? Well, because we have enough copies. God has provided us with so many copies through his providence and his wisdom. Not original copies. Nobody can worship an original copy, or no ruler can say, aha, I know how to get rid of your Bible. I'm going to destroy all of your original manuscripts. They're gone. But there are so many copies that we can compare, contrast, and we can know what the text says. And none of these errors, we find something where there's a possibility of a copyist error. It's a list of names in Nehemiah. It's not what to do to become a Christian and go to heaven, right? So the things like that, we have no question about the things that involve salvation. But anyway, so he points out that he thinks that might very well be the best explanation. Trying to summarize what he says here without reading every single bit. The Jaddua in verse 22 might have been added by a subsequent editor. And that's another thing we talked about with copyist errors. Sometimes a copyist, there's something written in the margin to help clarify or to give a little further information. And sometimes as the fellow's copying, it's been a long day, maybe he's not paying attention, maybe he's tired, and sometimes they see something in the margin and it just gets copied right into the text. That's happened before as well. So that's kind of what he's thinking, and that it may have been inserted later on by mistake. All these 4 options may be defended, he says, and indeed have been defended by able scholars, so one may take his choice. But until the critics effectively refute all 4 of these options, we shall stick to our conviction that the appearance of the name of Jaddua in this chapter is no adequate basis whatsoever or whatever for late dating Nehemiah. And that's absolutely true. So it may be that this is just another, the Jaddua here in Nehemiah 12:22 is just somebody else who happens to have that same name. But it's not the one who met Alexander the Great, as Josephus records. It may be that got added in later on by a copyist mistake, or it might be that he was someone who lived so long that he was alive during the reign of Artaxerxes, very last part of Artaxerxes the first there, and lived to early days of Alexander the Great, latter days of Darius III. It's hard to say for sure which one of those, but as he points out, all 4 of those are a possibility. Now, what I want to mention today, does that make sense to those who, I don't know if anybody else had put that together, but any questions or anything else on that? Again, I'm very, very thankful. Please don't ever think you will hurt my feelings or offend me in any way, if you come and say, hey, Chad, this is not adding up for me. It's just, I'm having a hard time with that. And that was kind of what Brother Ken said to me last week. He said, I don't know. He said, maybe. And I just, sometimes you just realize, okay, maybe I haven't thought this through as much as I thought I had even as a teacher. So please don't ever do that. You will not upset me. It will encourage me because it says somebody's listening, they're thinking, they're processing it. And so I'm very, very thankful for that. So anyway, Samaritans. We've talked about Samaritans before. Who are the Samaritans? I'm going to have to summarize here. Who are the Samaritans?
They are people that the Syrians placed in that region to have control of that area.
Yeah, so the 721, 722, something like that, BC, the Assyrians take over the northern kingdom, or conquer the northern kingdom of Israel. So here you go, Shalmaneser the fifth. They take a lot of the Israelites into captivity, but don't want to just leave the land empty. So Assyrian policy typically was to repopulate an area. So they did. They bring in a lot of other conquered people and maybe captives from different places, but they also want control over the area, so there's going to be a governor type situation. But they began to mix among the people, and what you end up with is a race that is not fully Jewish, but not fully whatever other nationality these people were, and so you end up with the Samaritan race, and that's named after Samaria, which was the capital of the northern kingdom. But he talks a lot about this, and I'm going to do some summarization from what Pfeiffer talks about. But he mentions that the latter kings of Judah, Hezekiah and Josiah in particular, they would actually even make forays into the northern kingdom territory, but attempted to expand their borders, is the way he puts it in his book, northward into some of the conquered territory of the northern kingdom. But in those days, when you had the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, there was typically a lot of bickering between them. Once the northern kingdom fell, not so much so. The faithful Jews would make their way down south to be a part of Judah and to be a part of temple worship, depending on who the king was, right? Because some of the kings just closed the doors, even in Judah. They closed the doors of the temple. And some of them were, you had Hezekiah, Josiah, and others that were faithful, some more so, some less so. But they had the Jews that had remained in Palestine after the fall of the southern kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar's going to come, and you have the Esarhaddon the fifth who conquers the northern kingdom of Israel. You have about a 150-year period. And during that time, the Samaritan race develops. Then Judah is conquered, and several of them are taken captive. So now these people, especially the Jews who remain there in the Palestinian area, they're going to be at peace. You kind of have to be, almost out of necessity, with your surrounding folks. But then after 70 years, what happens? They kind of develop their own little economy and way of life during those 70 years of captivity. And then at the end of 70 years, Cyrus says, okay, I've read the passage in Isaiah. The God of heaven has called upon me to release his people. I'm going to do that. This was, again, not trying to make a knock against Cyrus' character, but he had his own reasons for doing this, but he was a humane ruler for the most part. And so he says, go home. If you want to go home, go home. And so some people do. Well, now if you're somebody there in the Jerusalem area or, the area back home, you've got kind of a dilemma because they come home and start, just rebuilding everything, and that kind of begins to threaten your way of life, your economy and all of that. So what are they going to do? Well, pretty much from the get-go, they harassed the Jews that returned. And I'm saying all this just to say this helps us to understand when you come to the New Testament and you have the Samaritan woman, for instance, in John 4, and she says, why are you talking to me, a Samaritan, and a woman on top of that? Because, the Samaritans, the Jews, have no dealings with the Samaritans. Well, I sometimes tell people, in fact, this is something that comes up sometimes when I'm giving a tour at the Biblical History Center, to say the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans, that's putting it pretty mildly. I can't remember the distances, I've looked it up before, but a lot of times it's kind of like if you wanted to go to, a particular city, I'm trying to think, maybe if you're going to go, I was trying to think of a place to go that there's not really a whole lot of options, but, say you needed to go through Carrollton to get somewhere, maybe LaGrange or somewhere like that. But boy, you cannot stand people from Carrollton. I mean, to the point that I will not even drive through their city. Man, I'm not even driving through their city. And somebody says, well, man, that's the way to go. That's the only way. No, give me another way. And somebody says, well, you got to go all the way over here and go way around. I'll do it. Man, that's going to take you like an hour longer. I don't care. Well, I mean, in their day, it took hours longer because, yes, sir, Bob?
That was before DV, all of these bypasses.
Yeah.
I also want to say that Sanballat, our friend, our enemy, was the governor of Samaria from the Persians.
Yes.
Remember, he had his daughter married to the high priest's brother, and there was some pretty messed up relations going on.
Yes, and so, again, they would go around Samaria, and it would be hours added to their journey. But the Jews would feel like, I'm not going through there because that'll make me unclean or something like that. Jesus, though, he goes through there, he talks to this lady, he shows that was not the right attitude to have. But yeah, that's all that just say, we sometimes say, Jews and Samaritans didn't like each other. Man, I mean, that's putting it very, very mildly. So here come the exiles. They return, right? And what's the first thing they set out to do? Rebuild the temple. And what happens? Samaritans come along, the people that had been there. I mean, we've been here for 70 years. You guys have been where? You're the Johnny-come-lately in our eyes. And so they say, hey, you know what? One of the things, if you go back and you study the account of the beginning of the Samaritan race, when the king of Assyria put those people there, he put them there because they were crying out. There were lions killing people, and they say, we need some people to teach us about their God. Well, it was kind of a real hodgepodge potpourri of religious teaching. It was some about Jehovah, but they weren't following Jehovah's law. Well, that continued, and so they have kind of their own corrupted worship and their own corrupted. In fact, there's even archaeologists have discovered what they refer to as the Samaritan Pentateuch, where they took references to not Sinai. What's the mountain? That's where they changed it to. Yeah, they built a temple there. What's the Temple Mount? Moriah. I think that's what I'm trying to think of. But anyway, I believe that was all the references to Jerusalem, Mount Moriah. But they changed it to Mount Gerizim because that's where they had their temple. So there's things that they changed a lot. But they come along and they say, great, rebuild the temple. We will help. And the Jews say, nope. And you read that account, maybe you've read that before in Ezra, and you think, ooh, I mean, that's kind of harsh, isn't it? I mean, all they want to do is help, right? But as Pfeiffer points out, he in fact says Jews had learned that cooperation with the idolater would bring the judgment of God. Remember, they're fresh off the captivity. And numero uno reason for being in captivity? Idolatry. And so in their defense, they're like, we're not fooling with you because you got this mixed up idolatrous version of Judaism going. Then Sanballat that Bob mentioned, he's the governor of Samaria under the Persians. So Persia, they're always going to have somebody in charge, right? Because they're still under Persian rule. Well, he's the governor. He couldn't get to the Jews. He couldn't get them to work with him by cooperation. And so, people haven't changed all that much throughout history, have they? In some ways. So you can't get them to work with you by cooperation. Well, we're going to switch now to coercion. So they threaten Nehemiah. They try to get him to meet with them in the plains of Ono, all these different things. But in spite of all that, Jews were able to rebuild the temple. They were able to rebuild the walls without any outside help, and in spite of outside interference, which is pretty amazing. One of the burdens that Ezra and Nehemiah both faced was, as Bob mentioned, the intermarriage. Some of these Jewish men would come and leave wives back where they're leaving from Babylon or Persia, and then they come over here and they marry foreign wives. And they're intermingling, and of course this was a big problem with Solomon. And so Ezra and Nehemiah are going to deal with this. Well, one of the great offenders was this priest, or a son of the priest. One of the sons of Joiada, the high priest. He married Sanballat's daughter. And Nehemiah just about lost it, as did Ezra. And so they are very upset. It was not only a mixed marriage, but it's a mixed marriage with an avowed enemy. And so then you have there's this son of the priest, Manasseh. That was the name of the fellow. I was looking for his name, Manasseh. He was Joiada's son. When he refused to give up his Samaritan bride, Nehemiah just expelled him. And again, remember, when we talk about Ezra and Nehemiah, they're not only giving religious instruction, but they have political clout too as well, right? Secretary of State of Jewish Affairs was the way one historian put Ezra's position. Nehemiah's was cupbearer, but he went back with some authority, right, if you recall. Well, the Samaritans did, as we mentioned, have a temple on Mount Gerizim. That was destroyed by the Jews in the days of John Hyrcanus. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. Josephus says the temple was built by Sanballat for Manasseh so that he could remain married to Sanballat's daughter, and he continued to serve as a priest, and he'd have his temple, even though Nehemiah had expelled him. He wasn't serving under the real priesthood, But by the way, I will go ahead and point out that Josephus' account is repudiated by some scholars as being embellishment, kind of a midrash on Nehemiah. I don't know, but it is interesting to think about. In the succeeding years, the Jews and the Samaritans, they become bitter enemies, of course. And as I mentioned, it's noteworthy to see how Jesus goes through Samaria, and he's teaching his apostles, he's teaching us, and all men for all time, that the gospel, as we often sing, of one the Lord has made the race, through one has come the fall, where sin has gone must go his grace. The gospel is for all. And Jesus shows that very clearly. One of the interesting things about Jews in captivity, and I mentioned that we touched on this very briefly, it's been a few weeks ago. Elephantine, there in Egypt, there was a Jewish, I guess you call it like a colony, and they actually had a temple there. But archaeologists have discovered there's some ancient papyri there written in Aramaic. It seems to be written by Jews between the years 494 and 400 BC. Now, these were not religious documents for the most part. They were business documents, contracts for loans, conveyance of property, similar activities. But it tells a lot about their lives at that time. The names used are familiar to all readers of the Bible, names like Hosea, Azariah, Zephaniah, and so on. But he says the most interesting document's a letter written in 407 BC. It was addressed to the governor of Judea, Bigvai. We read about him in the Bible. And it tells about Egyptian priests who they had help with kind of a conspiracy in the local government and the active assistance of the governor's son, they destroyed that temple that the Jews had built at Elephantine. And so they wrote this letter. I wish I had more time to read it, but they want help from the Jews in Palestine to rebuild it. But, buddy, you can read this letter, and it's in, if you want it, I can easily make you a copy. I've got it right here in these copied pages from Pfeiffer's book. It sounds a lot like sometimes talking to somebody today, they pepper in a little bit of truth about the God of heaven and a whole lot of misunderstanding. And sometimes you just talk to people. I've told you before when I'd be at Blue Cross and talking to somebody on the phone, and somebody might say something, and maybe something in the conversation, they'd say, "Oh, you're a Christian man?" I'd say, "Well, yes, ma'am. Yes, sir." "Oh, yeah, me too." And then they sometimes start talking, and it, not always, but a lot of times it wouldn't be long, and they'd say something, and I'm just kind of going like, "What?" It's obvious they're peppering in some wild ideas that they have of their own. One of the things that, people say all the time, I heard it so often, "Well, it's just like the Bible says. We're in the end times, and, wars and rumors of wars. The Lord will going to be coming back soon." And I'd just say, "Well, where does the Bible say that?" "Well, I don't know, but I've seen it in there." "Have you?" I think I have." "Well, maybe I just heard somebody say that." Sometimes they start backing up, and I'd say, "You ought to look and see if you can find that." These Elephantine Jews, they were concerned about the temple and the worship of the God of Israel, but again, they didn't maintain the purity of worship that God called for in the law of Moses and that the prophets of Israel called upon. And so there's no indication that their Jewish brethren in Palestine helped out. And again, they understood cooperation with the idolaters brought judgment from God. But among the other gods that those in Egypt, the Elephantine Jews, worship were, there's several. I'm not even going to try to attempt those names to pronounce them, but they were Canaanite gods, and one was a goddess of fertility and war, a sister and consort of Baal. But they're worshiping multiple gods. And the Jews back home are going, "No, this is why we've been in captivity." And so, again, it adds to that hostility. And when you get to the New Testament, it's kind of at a fever pitch. They just generally do not like each other, these Jews and Samaritans. And the Jews, the Elephantine Jews, by the very existence of a temple there, they rejected what? That's kind of central to the law of Moses. The temple at Jerusalem, the centralized worship of Jehovah. And you're going to see that breaks down. We didn't get to talk about the synagogue day, but we will, Lord willing, next time mention that, because that's going to decentralize worship, and it's going to really, really affect and help with the spreading of the gospel and this fullness of times when everything is just right for the Messiah to come into the world. I spent a lot of time on the problem of Jaddua, but I wanted to deal with that today. I wanted to get to the synagogue, but Lord willing, we'll talk about that next week and how that really, really helps to influence the world and prepare the Jews, the Jewish nation, for the advent of the Messiah. But one of the great, great things that if you don't have some background is it's hard to understand the animosity between Jews and Samaritans. So hopefully that helps you understand that a little bit better. All right, we'll have a break before worship this morning.